There are no dead animals mentioned in Leviticus 2, but God still had fairly specific requirements for grain offerings. Specifically, no yeast or honey was to be used as part of any burnt offerings. I thought it was interesting that both of these were mentioned together. Why is that? The Bible is interesting, sufficient, infallible, trustworthy, and not boring. If you like the content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Both yeast and flour together were used to make bread rise quickly, and were a metaphor for sin's effect on us. Even though yeast and honey made delicious bread by human standards, it was repulsive to God due to what it represented. There is more to it, though. As I dig more and more into these types of passages, I see how poetic God is. Yes, yeast represents sin and honey makes the yeast spread faster, but both yeast and honey have their own double meanings. Many scholars attribute the absence of yeast in burnt offerings as a throwback to when Israel was leaving Egypt and made provisions for the road quickly. This lack of yeast was a reminder of God's deliverance. Having this reminder of God's faithfulness in Egypt was right in line with how He is faithful to hear us when we offer sacrifices to Him. Honey is the other part of this sacrificial requirement. God is holy. The Hebrew word for holy means separate or set apart. The point is that God is separate from all the other pagan gods. He is a jealous God, which means He doesn't like to share with man-made gods. Honey, as it so happens, was frequently used in sacrifice to the pagan gods of the area. It smells gross to God when we offer up something to Him that we've used to worship something else. We can't just give God whatever we feel like or whatever is left over. He is God. He deserves respect. He deserves obedience. Part of that obedience is how we approach Him. Nowadays, we don't kill animals to cover our sin, but He does desire a broken and contrite heart. We can't just go through the motions. He requires obedience and a heart change before He will consider our sacrifice as pleasing. And with that, let's read the not boring Bible. Leviticus chapter 2. When you present grain as an offering to the Lord, the offering must consist of choice flour. You are to pour olive oil on it, sprinkle it with frankincense, and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest will scoop out a handful of the flour, moistened with oil, together with all the frankincense, and burn this representative portion on the altar. It is a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering will then be given to Aaron and his sons. This offering will be considered a most holy part of the special gifts presented to the Lord. If your offering is a grain offering baked in an oven, it must be made of choice flour, but without any yeast. It may be presented in the form of thin cakes mixed with olive oil, or wafers spread with olive oil. If your grain offering is cooked on a griddle, it must be made of choice flour mixed with olive oil but without any yeast. Break it in pieces and pour olive oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your grain offering is prepared in a pan, it must be made of choice flour and olive oil. No matter how a grain offering for the Lord has been prepared, bring it to the priest, who will present it at the altar. The priest will take a representative portion of the grain offering and burn it on the altar. It is a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering will then be given to Aaron and his sons as their food. This offering will be considered a most holy part of the special gifts presented to the Lord. Do not use yeast in preparing any of the grain offerings you present to the Lord, because no yeast or honey may be burned as a special gift presented to the Lord. You may add yeast and honey to an offering of the first crops of your harvest, but these must never be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Season all your grain offerings with salt to remind you of God's eternal covenant. Never forget to add salt to your grain offerings. If you present a grain offering to the Lord from the first portion of your harvest, bring fresh grain that is coarsely ground and roasted on a fire. Put olive oil on this grain offering and sprinkle it with frankincense. The priest will take a representative portion of the grain, moistened with oil, together with all the frankincense, and burn it as a special gift presented to the Lord. I hope you enjoyed some not boring Bible reading.